is time to bring our next person, JC. I want to introduce you. And actually, I'm going to bring Deborah in to give your introduction to kind of lead this in. But I want to thank you for joining us today. Deborah?
Hey, hi, everybody. And hello, JC. First, let me say I want to thank Westcott, JC. But his name is actually Joseph Carey, but everyone calls him JC. And
that worked out like that.
Yes. And he's a gifted teacher as well as photographer. And I always like to refer to people with gifted teachers as having a good bedside manner. Just normally you use describe a doctor that way. He can talk about all these technical things without getting stuck in the geeky weeds, and it just makes it accessible to everyone. And so if you've always been, this is why this is called From Fear to Flash. If you've always been one of these people who have had a hard time getting a hang of Flash, he's your guy to be able to help you learn it, especially off-camera Flash, which is real easy for him to do off-camera Flash because he has like a 7-foot wingspan, so he can hold the camera off Flash just like, you know, it's on a stand, 10 feet away. But in any event, without further ado, here's JC.
JC, welcome. It's so nice to have you here, and I like the way you're doing the dark background with the light. Like, you know, we got this thing going on together here. So I have to ask you, like I'm doing all the other guests, and you just saw the video. In the most personal sense, what is photography to you?
Photography is something for me that started out as my passion and my hobby that has become my life, essentially. You know, after Zoe, my daughter, photography is everything. You'll hear me throughout my class. It gives me the ability to kind of control things that are uncontrollable, to capture moments that are going to be fleeting. Like when you're shooting the way that I shoot or you shoot, and we're shooting in 1/8,000th of a second slices of reality sometimes, knowing that I've captured that and can present it for to people in the future, but it's going to look the way that I see it. It's everything, because I can't draw, I can't paint, I can't sing, so I needed to be able to do something.
We're soul brothers, my friend. So I just want to ask you, you're going to give your presentation. I'm going to hand it over to you just a second. Do you want people? We have a little Q&A panel down there, and I want to invite people to ask questions. Do you want me to hold them to the end and ask you the questions at the end, and not to disrupt the flow, or kind of as we go? It's up to you.
What I think is easiest, having been doing some presentations since all this started, is to wait till the end.
Fantastic.
And we can just do the whole, hey, we've got Joey from Saddle River. He's a first-time caller, long-time listener, and this is his question.
Let's do it. Joey, you hold your damn comments to the end.
So write them down as we go.
There is a Q&A panel right down there. So use the Q&A instead of the chat. Throw your questions in there, so we will watch them, and JC will answer them at the end. JC, you have a share screen?
I'm doing it.
Fantastic. It's all yours, brother.
Go and share and play. Does that work?
It's good. You're
all right.
Live.
How's everybody doing? So I've already been introduced. I feel like I had Paul Bettany in A Knight's Tale there with Deborah. Thank you for giving that great introduction about me, about the guy who can do the geeky stuff without getting stuck in the weeds. That's actually a really nice thing to hear. I work at Westcott. I've been in the photo industry for a long time. I'm a shooter. I really appreciate them allowing me to have the time to do this and being one of the sponsors for this event. So this is me. Like Deborah said, I am Joseph Carey, which conveniently comes out to JC because that's what everybody calls me. If you hit me up on Instagram, or if you would decide to email me or visit me, I will answer you. I'm a lifetime image maker. Dad to Zoe is my #1 goal in life. Some of you may recognize me as a Super Bowl commercial model. That was my real calling in life, was to be a male model. But after a little while, I felt very shallow about that and decided that I would leave that life and focus on the things that make me happy, which is shooting. I've been blessed over my lifetime, really. But over the last bunch of years, I've gotten to shoot in Olympics, Triple Crowns, some world-class athletes. I've been able to travel and see things that I never thought I was going to see. Prior to my life in the photo industry, I always shot, but I was not a lighting person. I was scared of light, like a lot of people. In 2001, I found out what it meant to be scared, and also that I would not be starring in the NBA because I blew out my knee. And I moved forward in life. Once I met my baby mama and got the kid, then I knew what it was like to really be terrified. Once you're scared like that and you know what life is, what can be really scare you, then lighting suddenly ceases to be very terrifying. My goal in this class is to take you guys that maybe feel a little intimidated by flash, by the technical aspects of it, and break it down into a way that if you just follow these steps and ingrain them into you, you'll be able to concentrate more on the art part of it. And that was, for me, the key. Was at the beginning of my lighting career, I'd throw on a flash or I'd do this, and like I wouldn't like the results, and I'd stop and I'd go back to being a available light shooter. And eventually I realized that by being an available light shooter, it meant that I had to use whatever lights were available. And a lot of times that could be a strobe, or it could be a flashlight, or it could be anything. So let's get to it. Like a lot of you, I felt like this every time that I decided to try to add light to a scene. Like I could read my meter, I could set up a shot, I could do everything, but every time I started to add lights, I got a little bit flustered, you know. So after listening to people and failing a bazillion times and getting things wrong, you know, I really aim to try to get not only myself every day to feel better, but to make you guys be able to feel like this. So why should we add lights? Now, normally when I would teach this class live, you know, I'd wait for you guys to ask. And I would also, when I tell jokes, I would assume that they were funny because I'd hear you guys. So I'm just going to think that I'm amusing and that you guys know the answers. The reasons to add light are because a picture like this, where the camera tells me this is correctly exposed, doesn't look like this. A picture like this, where again, the camera's telling me that this is correct, but the sky looks like that. My vision for what the city should look like is that. The model has a little bit of edge, especially the guy model. Why should I stick with this picture when if I just add a couple of lights, you know, and these are just a couple of speed lights, you know, one of them inside of one of my Apollos, I can come to here. Like, there's a big difference between those two things. And if you're here on Tuesday or Wednesday, whatever day today is, you know, I'm in that COVID time warp that a lot of you guys are in. If you're here with me at 12 noon listening to this, then you're interested in being somebody who doesn't just take pictures. You want to be somebody who makes photos. You know, that is really the difference between somebody that is a photographer and somebody who just likes to take pictures. And there's nothing wrong with being somebody who likes to take pictures. This is World Photo Day. I'd rather you were doing it than not. But I strive to be able to make photos. Like, that's my thing. And we look at a picture like this, the sky looked like that. And now how do I get those two things? In this case, I just added one light. By adding one light, we ended up here. If I can do that easily, and 99% of the time, I'm by myself. There are a couple behind-the-scenes pictures here that show, you know, me with my VAL, but 99% I'm here, and there's nothing in this class that you shouldn't be able to do. 90% of these pictures are one light, the other 10% are two, and there's, you know, all right, we'll say 88% are one light, 10% are two lights, and the rest have three. So again, why should we add light? We live in the best time ever as far as being a photographer, right? ISOs on the cameras are through the roof. We can capture light in a way that we could not before. You know, we're seeing cameras that are clean at 16,000 and even above that. So it's not the amount of light isn't the real main reason to add light. We add light for one reason and one reason only, and that's creativity. And that's why we're photographers. You know, photography is the perfect blend of art and science. You know, there are rules and there are things that guide us, but still we want to be creative. We want to make a picture that doesn't necessarily reflect reality, but it's the best version of reality for us. If the ambient light bores you, add light. I mean, that's really why to add light. There's going to be tons of times where you're going to get great light, and if you see great light, shoot it. Capture that. Take the picture. And don't be the person that is driving by and goes, that's great light, I'm going to come back and get that. The light's never there again. Just shoot it. But if you're going to be somebody who wants to do this as even just as a real hobby, you need to be able to create good light all the time because it's not always going to be there. So let's jump in. This is as commercial as this is going to get, but I think it's important because a lot of people that are watching, I find, might not even know what a softbox is or an umbrella is. It's funny, like when you're dealing with this, like I'll say something, I just assume that it's something that everybody knows, but then they don't. So almost all the pictures in here are either taken with a speed light in one of these modifiers or with one of these 400 watt strobes that Westcott makes. That covers everything. Everything in here is a speed light or that. 90% of the pictures in here were shot with one of these modifiers. And, if you have questions about that, hit me on the email. I'll show it again at the end. I'm not here to talk to you too much about that. It's more about how to do this process. So these are my rules for flash photography, which are more like guidelines. Photography is art, but it's also math and science. So there are rules. I do recommend that if you're trying to do something creative, that you break the rules. But there are some guidelines that we need to start with and get ourselves into the right frame of mind so that when we decide to light, we don't get frustrated. The first skill, that's interesting. That changed between yesterday and today, so I didn't have the end drop down the bottom. Pre-visualization is that ability to be able to look at a scene and think about it in terms of f-stops, in shutter speed, and ISO, and think about what it's going to look like before you even push the shutter button, before you've even picked up your camera. You will, if you spend any time with me, you'll see me staring off sometimes, and you'll think that I'm, just lost. I'm looking at a scene, and I'm thinking about how I would light it. I'm thinking about how that person that's coming by would look best. Pre-visualization is easier than ever because we're shooting so many mirrorless cameras today. So there is a what you see is what you get element of looking through. But if you want to shoot strobes or any kind of a light source that's really fast, that's not going to be applied. You're not going to see that in the viewfinder. So you still need to have that ability. And for me, it's really about building up a catalog in my head of how things looked good at what ISO, what shutter speed, being able to look at a scene, kind of lick your finger, look around and go, all right, that's 2.8 at 2500th of a second. Building that up has never been easier because in Lightroom or Photo Mechanic or Capture or whatever program you use, all the exit data is right there. So look at it. When you get something that works for you, and I'm not just talking about a picture that you lit. Like when I started all this, there would often be times where I'd aim my camera at the sky to be like, what's the exposure for this sky? How do I get this? Build that up. But remember that the other flip side of that is learning to revel in the mistakes that you're going to make. There's one reason and one reason only that I can get from a scene that has no lights in it to a lit scene that's relatively decent quickly, and it's because I made so many mistakes. I failed so many times. So once you guys fail as much as me, you'll be able to do everything we did here. The last thing to get ready as far as frame of mind for me is to keep it simple. Photographers love gear. I want you to love gear. I work for a company that sells gear. Hope you go buy some gear at the end of this. But don't get lost in that. Remember that sometimes simple is best. Don't be the person who shows up at something and is dying to use what they have and doesn't realize that what they brought with them or the space doesn't fit what your vision was. Be willing to stop, take a breath, step back, and keep it simple. This picture's here because one of the last things I got to do seriously before COVID was Met spring training. And originally they had a space for me that was, 12 feet wide, 20 feet deep. I was going to set up, strip lights on the sides and a fill light on the bottom and all of this. And then when we got there, they decided that I basically had 3 feet deep and about 3 feet wide. And so instead of getting frustrated and losing it, just took a step back and simplified the whole process and still made good pictures. So don't get frustrated if you don't get everything you want the first time. It's a process. One of my first rules for this is to put the camera in manual. I'm not talking about TTL or manual on your flash, but if you're going to shoot flash, despite the fact that every camera manufacturer has made a lot of money and invested a lot of money figuring out how P and aperture priority and shutter priority work, for me, if you want full control, and I mentioned this in my intro, being a little bit of a control freak is why I like light so much. Being able to make light wherever I go. So for me, if you want to be able to really take full advantage of your camera and create scenes that are the way you see them, put the camera in manual, at least when you're shooting flash. And why is that? In aperture priority at 2.8, it gave me a 200th of a second, but that's not the picture I wanted. By shooting manual, instead of having to revert to using, some sort of a compensation, I was able just to change the shutter speed. Changing the shutter speed changed the whole background of this image, while the fact that I'm lighting Zoe here means that she stays the same. We're going to get more into that in a couple of minutes. My second rule, guideline, is to get the light out of the shoe or away from the plane of your lens. There's definitely times when we should break that rule. Like if you have a passport business or you've got a great white wall and you want to bounce your light off of it. But in general, the human eye does not see light straightforward like that. Most people aren't lit that way. So it looks slightly unnatural. If you're shooting it that way because you want it to look unnatural, like glamour or something like that, then go for it. But in general, play with getting the flash off the axis of your lens. Why is that? So there's different characteristics of light. There's the amount, which we've already talked about. And the amount's the easiest thing for everybody to think about because we understand that if we just raise the ISO, we can change the amount of light. If we turn up the flash, we can change the amount of light. But amount is like a small part in the recipe that makes up a good picture. The direction of the light, the hardness of the light, the color of the light are all things that are going to help convey feeling, change what the viewer thinks of when they look at the picture. The second picture of the fireman there, that's taken at noon, but we gelled that light, controlled the ambient exposure so it looked like it was a nighttime scene. Likewise, the picture on the right is not a sunset picture, although it gives that feeling because I've changed the direction and the color of the light. When I talk about directionality, what am I talking about? Well, where the light's coming from. And where the light's coming from is a big creative decision. Front light is going to eliminate most shadows. It's going to give you a certain feeling. I like that picture. It's a good picture, but the light is coming all from the front, and that's not terribly realistic. Side light is obviously coming from the side. It gives a lot more of a sense of structure to the picture, a lot more depth, because it adds shadows. A good friend of mine, Silarina, was the first one that said it to me, and it clicked, and this is 15 years ago at this point, I'm getting old fast, that it's not just great light that makes a great photo, it's great shadows. And he was absolutely right. Now, backlight, obviously, is light that's coming from the back. It's often called separation light, hair light, rim light, edge light. Very rarely am I going to use it by itself like I have in this scene here, but it's there to show you the effect that can have to really separate somebody from the background. And it's really an important tool to have. There's a lot of times, though, where the sun becomes my backlight, my edge light. Just remember that you need to worry in 3 dimensions. You need to think about challenges in 3 dimensions. Uplight is the one that I use the least, but it's still important to understand it. Uplight, because after millions of years of evolution of us not seeing light come from the ground very often, it looks unnatural. And even somebody as gentle and approachable as my friend Gavin there can look intimidating when you add uplight to them. So it's something to think about, just not something to focus on. There's a reason that it's called monster lighting in the cinema world. When we talk about hard light versus soft light, this is the thing that you're going to hear people talk about constantly, especially for portrait shooters. And hard light is like what we have on the right there. Extreme shadows, very contrasty. Soft light, this is an extreme version of it on the left because there's hardly any shadows. But how do we get soft light? Well, we get soft light by changing the size of the light source in relation to the size of the subject. The bigger the light source is in relation to our subject, the softer it will be. So just remember, because you use an umbrella or a 7-foot octa or something giant, you're not going to get soft light if you take it and you move it far away. It'll be softer than a bare light, of course, but it won't be as soft as it could be if it's really close to your subject. Close to your subject, I know this is counterintuitive to some people. Every time I teach this and I ask, how do you get softer light by moving it closer or farther back? People will say moving it farther back. That actually makes the light harder. It obviously makes it less amount of light, but don't confuse the amount of light for the softness. How do we get it? There's all kinds of different light modifiers, and light modifiers are tools that dictate how the light from our strobe or even a continuous light source. 95% of what we're talking about in this class is applicable to all light. How does that light paint our subject? Everybody knows that photography is painting with light. So every modifier can be seen as a different kind of brush, a brush that's going to affect how our end user perceives our subject. Umbrellas are like a great starting point for taking a small light source and making it diffuse and soft, and I love them. The problem with umbrellas for me, or the challenge that I have with umbrellas, is that the light goes everywhere. So if I'm in a situation where I really want more control and I want the lights just to paint my subject, an umbrella is not necessarily the best choice. We can feather with it, move it around. There's a lot of tricks to do, but when you're first starting, if you want soft light, umbrellas are great, but if you want more control, a softbox is definitely the way to go, if you ask me. Especially if you decide to combine a grid, which is the bottom line there, with a softbox. It gives you a bigger light source, but with light going in one direction. Then there's a whole industry full of small modifiers, like Westcott makes pocket boxes. There's a ton of them out there, and they're all useful in taking, especially speed lights, which are a tiny light source, and making them slightly softer. Just remember that if you're shooting a figurine with a speed light, it's going to be soft because in relation to the size of the subject, it is soft. Let's not waste too much time talking about that. Instead, let's get to some examples that show what I'm talking about. So here's a case, I got to go to China, and I couldn't have cast this guy better if I wanted to. If you'd have been like, man, if I was shooting an editorial and it called for man sitting on Great Wall with a pipe, like this would have been the guy. He looked like he was around there to build the Great Wall of China. And so I took the speed light, handed it to a tourist, and said, move way back. And why did I have him move it way back? Because I wanted the light source to be as small and hard as possible. It'd be a disservice to the story that I'm trying to tell, and quite honestly, a disservice to the years of, environmental abuse that this guy took. Every one of those wrinkles helps tell his story. And if I take that away by making this picture softer, I'm not really telling the story that I want to tell. So that's one end of this. At the other end, we've got umbrellas. An umbrella is, like, again, a great light source if you need soft light. And in this case, so there's outer frame. I take the umbrella till I put it right there, and then I move it back again because I want it as close as possible to make it the biggest light source that I can, while at the same time being soft. Hope that makes sense. Here's a softbox in play with a grid, and what makes this great and why I couldn't use an umbrella here is an umbrella would have thrown light everywhere in the scene. It would have filled in all the shadows. It would have taken away the musculature in her arms, which are a big part. This is why we decided to shoot me and this woman. She had just turned 50, went to the gym. She wanted to show off the fact that she had just had a successful, purposeful weight loss, that she had been adding muscle. Taking that away by putting in a really soft light source wouldn't be the best thing for her. But with that same medium rapid box, now move to the other side, I can eliminate all the shadows. So directionality is just as important as which modifier you use. Here's an example of why when you decide to set up a shot, thinking about what modifier you're going to use is important. This is a picture of my friend Jazz. I really like the picture. I tend to go towards a very flashy style in general, and this was a picture where I really wanted something that was more natural. The problem is that because I decided to use a rectangular softbox, a 2x3 in this case, I ended up with that hard line by her feet. Now, until I pointed that out to you, a lot of people don't see it. Lighting geeks see it right away. And if you could go into the catch light in her eyes, it's a square catch light, which doesn't seem natural because the sun's not square. So just remember when you're deciding what modifiers you want or how you're going to light a scene, that unless you're lighting something for effect, that you want to go with something that looks kind of natural if you're trying for natural. This is just a picture of a pocket box showing that you can get very soft light just by putting something very close to your subject, even if you're using something small like a speed light. So let's move forward because we're on a time frame here, and as much as I would like to stay with you guys all day, let's not hang around for this. Let's move forward and get to the real process. So of all the quotes that I've ever heard in photography, this was the one that, I liked the best because it came from a guy who's like a true master. Don't get discouraged. Art is hard. I can't find you interesting subjects. I can't put you in cool spots to do it. But what I can do here, if you follow this process that we're about to go through, is I can put you in a situation where rather than fiddling around with your settings, you can worry about being creative. If I move, let's go forward. If somebody had told me this 15 years ago, I think that I'd actually be better than just competent now. Every flash image is 2 separate exposures. And what do I mean by that? There's the light that's on my subject that I've added to the scene, and there's the light in the scene that was existing. Between those 2 pictures, the only thing that's changed is the shutter speed. This picture is 1/1250th of a second. This picture is 1/125th of a second. Aside from the fact that ambient light apparently blows light onto people's heads, his exposure is exactly the same because that's all coming from me. I've added that light. The light that's in the background is that's the natural light, the available light. And I controlled it by making some creative decisions. Here's another good example of that. What I mean when I say that there's 2 different exposures in every picture. There's the exposure for the background. In this case, it's a beautiful sunrise. It's stunning. But if I light my subject naturally, I would have to open up this shot a lot because there was not a lot of ambient light. It was very dark. It was early in the morning, like 5:30. I've added with a big umbrella, 1 light source to this, and able to totally change the way that this scene is perceived by the end user, obviously. We went from a silhouette to a picture that is now a portrait of my subject that happens to be in front of a great sky. But those 2 exposures are totally independent of each other. If you can remember that, all this gets a lot easier. Just another quick one. Starting with my aperture, then going to a shutter speed, and the camera tells me this is correct. Well, it is, but it's not great because there's the sky that was actually out. It wasn't a great sky, but at least it's relative to what it is. But just by adding light, not only does it make for a more dynamic picture, it also makes models happy. You see? All you got to do is add light and everybody gets happier. All right. I'm going to assume you guys are smiling. So here we go. Here's the 3 steps to better lighting that I've been promising since the start of this whole thing. All the rest of that was frame of mind, was getting you guys in the right headspace. And here's just my process that if you follow, you can be more creative later. Try to take this and internalize it, these decisions, to the point where you don't have to think about it anymore, but they are part of you when you decide to light. My first step is to pick an aperture. And I pick an aperture to control the depth of field, not to change the power of my flash. If you decide to geek out and go deep into lighting, you will eventually hear somebody that says, well, aperture controls the flash. Yes, if I'm shooting this picture at 2.8 and I decide to change it to f4, I will have halved the amount of light that's getting to my subject. But I would also have to change my shutter speed. I'd also have to change everything else. And I also, more importantly to me, changed my depth of field. Depth of field to me, along with the light and the composition, are the tools that I have to tell people that I'm not going to be with later on what I want them to see. For those of you that maybe don't 100% understand what we mean that aperture controls the depth of field, here is, we're going from 1.4 to f16 there. Remember this though, and when I do the long version of this class, which takes closer to 2 hours, I do have a step before this, which is focal length. Your focal length is going to go a long way towards your aperture choice because your depth of field isn't, too many people in the world, I think, go into a store and go, hey, I need a really fast lens so I can get great bokeh. And what somebody behind the counter sells them a 35 millimeter 1.4, and it's a fantastic lens. But a 35 1.4 at 2.8 and a 200 millimeter at 200 at 2.8 have drastically different bokehs. The out of focus is completely different. So remember that the first real step before I did this, and I had to cut this down a little bit to make it, more reasonable, is lens choice because it affects your aperture choice. So aperture, why are we picking aperture first? Again, depth of field. There's going to be times where the story that you want to tell requires less depth of field. If the background is distracting, if the background doesn't help you tell your story, then shoot fast. Shoot with a really fast aperture because it's going to eliminate all that. There's other times where shooting a ton of depth of field is going to help you make a better picture as well. Here's a case where I'm shooting at f20. It's not something I very often do, but I had enough light because I switched to using a 400 watt light instead of a speed light. Because I could do that, f20 made sure that as much of the corn as possible was sharp, fancies as sharp as possible, and I just had to add that light after. Again, I kind of discussed this. Just remember, your wide lenses are going to have more apparent depth of field, even at fast apertures. Here's an example with a 20 millimeter lens where even though I'm shooting it at 2.8, don't think that just because you're shooting at 2.8, you're getting a lot of blur in the background. I run into so many people that think that. I think this group's a little more advanced, but I do know it was open to the public. And so sorry if it sounds like I'm just talking down to some of the people that are advanced, but there are a lot of people that just think that because they've got a 2.8 lens or a 1.4 lens that they're going to get very shallow depth of field. Remember that your wide lenses are never going to be super shallow. And that's great if that's the story you're trying to tell. Then we have it like this, where you saw the pictures I was shooting. We were shooting some action early, with this guy, and I saw him, and I'm like, I got to shoot this guy. He's just got so much character. He's great. But the field that we were on was ugly. There was nothing good in the background of this. So using a 105 millimeter lens at f2, the depth of field is dramatically different. You can see between those two pictures that we just looked at. We've got a 2.8 and we've got an f2. It's the only difference between these, yes, there's one stop, but that doesn't make for that depth of field loss. It's the focal length. So remember to think about focal length when you're thinking about your depth of field and your aperture. So why do I pick aperture first? Because once I've picked an aperture, now I can start dialing in my shutter speed. And my shutter speed is not going to change the light on my subject so much. It will eventually if we go to high-speed sync. But in general, I'm lighting the subject. So we don't worry about them. When I teach this live, I make everybody go through this process without ever having the lights on. Picking an aperture, then picking a shutter speed to control the ambient. And what do I mean by that? So this is a 40th of a second. This is a 100th of a second. This is 6/40th of a second. Just to go a little slower. 40th, the window light in the back is letting in a ton of light into this location. It's reduced by the time I get to 100th of a second. By the time I get to 6/40th, I'm probably only one more stop away from eliminating all of the ambient light. Having that control is what's going to make you a photographer. So I've now not changed anything else in this. I've decided that the depth of field that I wanted on this lens at f5 was going to fit my needs. Now I'm free to change shutter speed. Again, why I want to shoot manual. Changing shutter speed is going to give me a totally different look for that background. And I can either make it be very important to the scene, or I can make it less important to the scene and make it more about my subject. Here's some examples of that in action. So here's a picture at a 1/4 second at f9. So why am I picking f9? f9 means that Radio City and the street is all going to be sharp. A 1/4 second, now it's important to talk about this a little bit without geeking out too much. There's flash duration and there's shutter speed, and they're two different things. The flash duration is going to freeze the action. So even though Mari here can't really hold steady for a 1/4 second, she's going to be sharp because the flash freezes her. In a 1/4 second, though, everything that's moving, the cars in this situation, are going to show up like blurs. When you're in a low light situation, a small change in shutter speed can be very dramatic. Here's a 1/4 second. Here's a 25th of a second. Nothing else has changed in that scene. Same modifier, same lens, same ISO, same f-stop. I've changed 2.5 stops of shutter speed to give you one picture, which in my opinion almost looks like a composite because she almost matches the background light too much. Just something that looks very neo-noir, more mysterious. So all of that is just by changing shutter speed. Here's another example of that real quick. Here's close to the ambient exposure at 1/8 was about a 400th of a second. I've added some light to that scene just because it makes her stand out a little bit more. But right after that, I decided that I really started with the picture on the right, if I'm being honest here. Okay, there we go. The picture on the right was the picture that I wanted artistically. You know, I'd already shot a whole bunch of stuff that was natural light looking, or at least more even. So I went to this 8,000th of a second picture, which eliminated almost all of the stuff that was in the background. You know, we pretty much had a black frame except for the light that I added. But just to show the difference, you know, I took the picture on the left, and I like the picture. I don't like it like I like the picture on the right, but it's to show you that we think of a 1,000th of a second as super fast, or an 8,000th of a second to be ridiculously fast. To the camera, they are dramatically different. You know, we don't think about there being much difference. Just remember that you have full control over your ambient with your shutter. That's all I need to say. More examples of that. You know, no reason to really dwell on these. This is a situation in a cafeteria where the choking victim signs and all of the HR stuff wasn't important to my picture. The story that I wanted to tell is just about my friend Skip. You know, there's nothing else in that scene that's important. So I followed that process that we just talked about. 2.8 gave me the depth of field that was good for this shot. 2,500th of a second would have given me a black frame. All of the light in this picture is coming from my strobe. This is one of those situations where, okay, fun with transitions. So they give me a closet, essentially, to shoot these pictures of the Mets, and they don't give me a black background, and I wasn't there to shoot. I was there to assist. This is a couple of years ago. I was there to help out the Met team photographer. So the room was about a 15th of a second for ambient, where you saw that picture of me, and I couldn't obviously have those lockers showing up in the background. So at 1/60th of a second, which isn't that fast, it's not even high-speed sync, it still gave me a black frame. Now, combining the black frame with directional light, I was able to keep the light from going into the lockers in the back. You know, I definitely put him 5-6 feet in front of it, so, you know, there wouldn't be light spill, but you can make a situation where you shoot high key or low key anywhere as long as you control your shutter speed. And then after that, you're at that last step. Now, this is, you know, obviously, this is the art of it, if you ask me. The rest of it, it's a lot of science. It's a lot of science. It's thinking, learning to speak to yourself in f-stops. You know, I'll often look at, you know, a scene and where I'm talking to a student live, and I'll be, you know, they show me a picture, and I'm like, all right, well, you know, how much do you want that change, the background? And they'll be like, oh, I don't know. I'm like, well, how many stops difference do you want it? And it's important to think like that. If you can get yourself to think in terms of stops and in terms of how I want to control the things that I can control, then do that. In this case, and you notice, anybody who's looking at this work sees that I underexpose my backgrounds a lot because they're not the most important part of my picture, because I'm a portrait shooter. I think of myself as somebody who's a portrait shooter. So my subject is obviously the most important thing. And like I said, we have aperture, depth of field, and then we have where the light goes on our scene to make sure that people look where we want them to look, because we're very rarely going to have the chance to stand in front of a group and explain to them what we were thinking when we took this picture. So if we want them to see what we see in our heads, we need to be pretty clear about it. All right. Adding the light is the art. If you can internalize those first two steps, then this is the part where you get to be creative and move the lights around. I can tell you that I generally start about 45 degrees out to one side and 45 degrees up, but very rarely do I end up there. I tend to do a little bit harder lighting to the right or to the left because I like the look. But the fact is that if I don't do those other parts, I can't get to time here to I don't want to say mess around, but to experiment. You know, when we're looking through our camera and we're looking at the picture and it's not quite right, we don't want the subject to know that. So what we need to do is look through and go, that looks fantastic. but let me move this a little bit. My friend, Joey Terrell is a genius, and he describes this often as almost like dealing with a sculpture. The first two parts to me are building that block of marble. Where we decide to put the light, that's sculpting and chipping away until we get exactly what we want. How can we control the light? So yeah, I said that we add the flash is my last step. How can we control it? Flash compensation, manual adjustment, modifiers, inverse square law. Flash compensation in TTL, I guess first we need to talk a little bit about what TTL is. Sorry about that. TTL is through the lens metering. There's a pre-flash, hits the subject, comes back through the lens, and the camera decides how much output of light it needs to make a correct exposure. It is really great in situations where you're running and gunning, where you are changing your light to subject to distance continuously, but there's some downsides, in my opinion. For some reason, all the people that I shoot, who are mostly my friends, seem to be very prone to blinking on the pre-flash. When you shoot manual, you don't have that pre-flash. The other problem with TTL is that TTL is built around a system of, it wants a neutral middle exposure. So when it gets challenged by situations where the subject has dark skin tones or there's lots of dark in the scene, the pre-flash hits the scene and it goes, we need to add more light to this, and it will often overexpose those scenes. Likewise, when you have somebody that's like me that's very related to a Sasquatch or something, very pale, the light will hit me. It'll say, we don't need to throw hardly any light at this, and it will underexpose the scene. If you understand that going into shooting with TTL, then TTL can be great because it's going to be very fast. It's going to change faster than you could ever think about. And that's great. I do shoot mostly manual. I don't shoot mostly manual because I'm smarter or better than the computer. I'm not. It's because I mostly shoot subjects where my flash to subject distance is not changing. I'm setting up the lights, I'm setting up my subject, and I want the continuous, the ability to be consistent between every shot. The only thing changing in my shots usually is my shutter speed or where I'm standing in the shot. Yes, eventually I will move my models, but at that point I have to move my lights. The benefits to me of shooting manual are consistency. The lack of pre-flash means that people are less prone to blinking. There are some people that are just super prone to the flash, but in general, if you take away the pre-flash, you're not going to get so much blinking. Likewise, you get a little bit more power out of your flash because there's no pre-flash, and you get a little bit more battery life. Those are all advantages to it. Modifiers, depending on what we decide to put in front of the lens of the flash, or a lot of modifiers work by bouncing the light back into something, it is going to reduce the amount of power that's coming to our subject. So you need to know that going in. And then there's inverse square law. Inverse square law is the most interesting and complex to everybody. How inverse square law works is that the closer the light is to the subject, the more powerful it is. That makes sense. But what you need to remember, especially if you're using speed lights or 400 watt lights or something that's not super, super powerful, is that every time you double the distance from your subject, you quarter the light. I don't want to bog you guys down in this. Other than that, this last part is important to know creatively. The less difference between exposures in a scene, the farther away the flash gets from the subject. So if I'm lighting a group and I've got them 3 deep and I need the people in the back to be equally exposed to the people in the front, I need to take the light and move it farther back. But what does that do? It makes the light harder, which means I need a much bigger light source and more powerful lights to evenly light a scene. When we shoot the Mets team team photos, we're using 3 or 4 7-foot umbrellas because we need a ton of light to hit that and carry from the front people to the back people evenly. Likewise, if I'm shooting against a black wall or any kind of wall and I want the fall off to be fast, and this is counterintuitive for a lot of people, I need to put the light very close. The closer to the subject that I put the light, the faster the fall off will be. I have an example of this to show you in a couple of minutes. We talked about TTL. Good. We talked about manual adjustment. It's really the way that I go. So let's sum up everything I said on one slide before we get to some examples and to some questions from you guys. Aperture controls depth of field. If you change aperture in the middle of a shoot because you decide you need more depth of field, remember that you're going to have to change your shutter speed if you want the ambient exposure to be the same. So don't change aperture just to change the power on the light. There's other ways for us to do that we just talked about. Shutter controls the ambient light. We all know it. We do it every day, whether you're a light shooter or just a landscape shooter. If you change your shutter speed, you control how much light's in the scene. It makes sense. And then you control the light. And you control the light either by changing it with exposure compensation, by changing the amount, or by changing where it is, how far away or how close it is to our subject, or what kind of a modifier we put onto it. If I decide to use something that's gridded, I'm going to have a lot less light, but more direct. So here's process part 2. I'm going to go through this pretty fast. If you guys have questions about anything that's there, again, I'll give you my contact information, and also there's the Q&A. Write them down, and we'll talk about them as long as they'll have me. Here's 2 pictures taken, I think, 17 seconds apart, and the only thing that changed between the 2 of them, shutter speed. And the entire mood of the shot gets changed that way. So remember, like, that when you're shooting, don't get so focused on what you think was right at the start, because this 2.5 at 1,000th on the left, like, I really liked it. It's a nice picture. But I changed everything about the picture without having to change where the lights were or change where they were, just by shifting my shutter speed a little bit. Open shade can be one of your best friends because it's going to amplify the power of your lights. If I shot this same picture in the other side of this without the, where she's in the sun, well, first of all, she'd be lit by the sun. Stacy has very sensitive eyes to the sun, so she tends to squint a little bit. So if I can put her in shade, I always will. It's going to allow her to be a little bit more, expressive with her eyes. But in this case, I really wanted you to know that we're at the beach. I wanted you to know that there was some water back there. So 0.008 of a second is what gave that to me. Adding 2 speed lights, you get something like this. We had an umbrella, and the umbrella, this is one of the last shots before the umbrella broke. It was windy as could be. That the flag was held up by the wind. It was a crazy day. The gusts would come by, and they tore up my umbrella. So most of the pictures from this day ended up being bare flash. The key to look at in this picture, to me, even though it's a small, small part, is that separation light that's coming from the back. You can see it along the front of her back, the camera right thigh. You can see it under her arm on the arm that's farther back. You can also see it on her wrist and along the bikini. It really separates her from the backdrop and doesn't let her get lost in there. If you watch this class and you don't pay attention to every bit of EXIF data, you'll think that I'm always shooting high-speed sync, and you'll think that I'm always shooting super fast apertures. But there's a lot of other times where it's group photography or something like that where I need depth. This is a situation where I was there to shoot the band playing live around the corner, and they were like, hey, how about you get a picture of us? I'm like, okay. So I've got 2 speed lights with me. I don't have any mods with me. I have to do this really fast because everybody asks you to do stuff, but then they give you like 40 seconds to do it. So F13 was going to give me depth of field, which is what I needed. I needed to make sure they were all sharp. I didn't want this to turn into a situation where the lead guitar player or the singer was sharp and everybody else kind of a blur. We didn't want that. So everybody is sharp at F13. 2/50th of a second gives me the clouds exactly how I want. Then I add the lights. By adding the light in, it changes the whole dynamic of that picture, obviously. I could have shot the picture with no lights, obviously, but if I shot this picture with no lights, the sky would be white. Here's a case where I'm trying to be a little bit more natural. There's not a big change in underexposure between the 2 things. Normally when I shoot a picture like this, I would be tempted to shoot this at 1,000th of a second or 12/50th of a second to get the sky to be a little bluer, but it was one of those days where it was just hot and hazy, and there was no definition in the clouds no matter what I did. So it became more important to let the background be natural looking. But even at that point, they were very much in shadow. By adding the light inside my orb, I got a natural looking light that doesn't really scream lit. We saw some examples from this already. It's a fun day. Shot this all with speed lights, 2 speed lights, one on the top. And I usually get a question about when you decide to use edge lights as an external source, like how do you determine to do it? What I generally do is I turn off my front light and I only shoot with the edge light first, because then I can see the effect much more clear and then add in my main light. These are in here solely so that you can see how lens selection has a lot to do with your choices going forward. 500 millimeter f4 lens. If I want the front wheels on that motorcycle to be sharp as well as the people that are in the picture, I had to stop down all the way to f11. Just added a couple of lights and it was great. You see that tree on the right side is out of focus. There's a power line through there. It's out of focus. Remember just how much influence your lens selection is going to have in every step that comes after. That's why this picture's in there. You know, it's a couple of minutes later, switch to the 20 millimeter lens. With the 20 at f5, everything's in focus. So we have f11 where hardly anything's in focus, and we have f5 where everything's in focus, and the only thing that changes is the lens. Remember, I can't, the number of people who come to me and think, well, you know, I've got a 1.4 lens, you know, a 20 millimeter 1.8, let's say, it's going to have great bokeh. It's not. Just remember that. Think about that when you're making your choices. Here's another with that lens. It's obviously one of my favorites. I like wide lenses. I tend to shoot a lot of short models. A wide lens will make them look taller if you get low. So I needed the shoes and I needed the dirt in focus. F9, 1,000th of a second gives me that sky. Then we add the light. All the light on her is coming from my light source. You know, not all of it, obviously. There's some balance here because I don't have 4 lights to light all the rock. But the light on her face, which lets you know that that's the first place to look, that's primarily coming out of the flash. Here's the inverse square law in play that we talked about before. So I've taken the speed light and I've making it into a big light source with the Apollo. I have my subject who's got like a very cool look. He's got a little bit of edge. He's got his flight jacket. He's got the head shaved. At 200th of a second, though, you know, it's a boring picture. So I go to 1/8,000th of a second. I eliminate all of the ambient light, everything, and I'm going to light him with that. So here's the thing. If I take that orb and I move it super close to him, the light would wrap around his face. I'd eliminate the shadows that are camera right. I would also make the wall go to black. And the details in the wall, those rivets and stuff, that's why I chose that background. Hi. Somebody beeped in. So remember where you put the light. Sometimes softest light isn't the best. Sometimes having it a little farther back, getting yourself some shadows, really is going to help make a creative decision that's going to make the image more memorable than if you just went with like, oh, let me be soft and be really close. I don't do a lot of Photoshop. I'm not a big Photoshop guy, but there's times where, you know, this is after we shot that other picture that I talked about. This is me and my friend Mark, and I needed soft light. But the umbrella had broke. We had a little bit of a Mary Poppins moment. Mark was about a foot into the air mid-shoot because the umbrella caught the wind and then popped. So to get it as close as possible, I had to do a little bit of Photoshop. So I put it into the scene, put it really close, and then I used the tool in Photoshop to get rid of that. I don't, you know, that's just so that you think about close is softer, even when you're using something that's bare. These two images were taken 30 seconds apart, completely different feels, and we talked a little bit about color, and I don't go into it as much as I probably should, because I don't do a lot of gelling, I don't do a lot of changing of my color. But it's something to think about and to have in your recipe book. So, you know, it's an ingredient to have when you're trying to make something. Picture on the left, 1/1600th of a second was a choice that I had made before I took the picture, poorly pre-visualized, thinking that that would give me a nice blue sky and thinking that it would, you know, let the trees be really rich and green. Problem is that 1/1600th, the sun is behind her, and 1/1600th didn't tame the hair there. Just couldn't do it. On the right, we changed to 6400th, changed into a big softbox, but also changed the color temperature. I'm going to speed. How much time do I got, Travis?
So we do have some questions. So we're at 12:30. At 1:30 is our next presentation. So we got half an hour, pretty much.
I'm gonna finish in 5.5 minutes.
Perfect.
And then we'll do the questions.
Sounds good.
Is that cool?
Yeah.
Thanks, Travis. All right. Here's a situation where I go backwards. I've preached that you got to pick the aperture, then pick the shutter speed. But there's going to be some instances, especially with long exposure, where you have to start with your shutter speed. The 4 seconds here was more important than any aperture decision I was going to make, because the depth of field here doesn't matter that much to me because the picture's all on a flat plane. But him spinning this and allowing those sparks to get some range away, 4 seconds was where I found to be the happiest. Then I used the f-stop to control the ambient light. I did it a little backwards in this case, but it's not the way that I would recommend trying to do it. Here's an extreme example of that, and this is all in one shot. Nikon ambassador Dave Black, definitely was the inspiration for this. He does amazing things with this, generally showing off athletes doing things with proper form. But for me, the best golfer in the world is Happy Gilmore. And so I said, hey, Mark, can you do this for me? Can you do a Happy Gilmore swing? So I have one speed light to the left, one speed light to the right with grids aimed straight back at him. During the course of a 10-second exposure where he moved super slow, we put some glow sticks on the golf clubs. He's going very slow. I turn on the flash once. I turn on the flash a second time. I turn on the flash a third time, and in a totally dark room, he gets exposed 3 times on that same frame. I talked about this before. Sun as a backlight, as an edge light. Don't be scared to put the subject with the sun at their back. Doing that, it's going to make really dynamic images. It's going to allow you to have the most inexpensive rear light that you can, and it's going to make for dynamic images. All right. Again, using that two flashes can be really make or break a shot. I've got an umbrella as my main light, camera right. It's pretty far hard to the right because I want the shadows to camera left on her chin and her cheek to give that definition. But that would get lost completely if I didn't have that bare speed light behind her, aimed straight back at her, which creates all that separation. Balancing the light that's outside that window with the light in the room to make it look interesting isn't always easy. Could have been done, but I would have the window there would be totally white if I had let this picture be lit with the natural light that was in the room. Getting some reflections by underexposing, 100th of a second gave me that. 2/50th of a second goes to there. Here is a 6/40th of a second to make them even richer. Don't be scared to go up and down the scale. Process stays the same. If we're shooting people, if we're shooting animals, if we're shooting art, whatever we decide to shoot. Here I had to go to f8 for various reasons. The main one being that the sage does not sit still. I needed a little bit of room for the focus to be tack sharp throughout. Here, even at f8, because I'm using a lens that's a little bit longer, he falls out of focus very quickly. So just remember, choose that for your depth of field. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. If it works on jellyfish. It works on everything. The process stays the same. And the more that you internalize that process, the easier it is to try to create. Here's Zoe's mom. Zoe wasn't tall enough to hold the light up for me, so I had to put it up on top of that wood. The first place I start is with aperture. Enough depth of field. 4,000th of a second gives me lots of window detail, gives me a little dynamic in the sky. I could have went to 8,000th of a second. The problem was all the wood to the camera left got too dark because I only had one speed light with me. Light source is placed as close as possible to make it as soft as I can. All right. This is the last story. I'm almost done. I really want to say again, thank you for the hosts. Thank you for the organization for having me on today. I really feel honored, honestly, with this list of speakers. Why do I carry my flash all the time? I do, because I carry some sort of light source with me, no matter what. I carry my camera all the time. I live by the thought that if you're not carrying your camera, you're just another person standing around staring at stuff. I likewise carry my lights, and there's one reason. So when I went to Brazil for the Olympics in 2016, I let pre-visualization get the best of me. I said that I'm going to shoot the greatest time lapse with the most fluffy clouds, and it's going to be amazing, of Christ the Redeemer. Nobody told me that Christ the Redeemer looks like this for a good part of the year. It's at the top of a rainforest. It's like, okay. So I'm an aperture priority. I'm at 7.1. It gives me 125th of a second. All right. I get it to 6/40th of a second, and it looks like this, and it's brutal. And I got one day off in Brazil, and every tourist that's up there for the Olympics is crying about this whole thing. So what do you do if your initials are JC and you're in front of Christ the Redeemer? Well, you take your flash, you put it on top of your tripod. That little foot that comes with all of your flashes that's got a 1/4-20 on it, it conveniently can screw onto the top of your tripod. So if you got tall enough tripod, you've got a light stand with you no matter where you go. I put it over there, and I practice levitation. So there's a little shadow behind me. I start doing that. The other tourists are looking at me, and they're like, "Hey, that looks great. You can you do that for me?" So we start doing it. This kid decides he's going to show off, and I'm like, "Listen, man, whatever a skinny little guy can do, a fat guy can do also." I show him that we can get up. While I'm laying on the ground shooting one of these pictures, I yell at my friend that's with me, Julie from Nikon Australia. I said, "Go grab her." She sees who I'm talking about. She walks over. "Hey, I see you, taking pictures with a cell phone. That's really awful. You're killing cats every time you take a picture with a cell phone." And, that's for my photo industry people that would rather we sell cameras. So I said, "Get her over here." Now, this picture is by far not the best picture I've ever taken. Not even close. I've got no modifier with me. I've only got one flash. The conditions are terrible. But because I had the flash, because this girl was visibly upset by the fact that she was going to be in Brazil for her one time, and this was the picture she was getting while she was shooting her selfies, was something like that's behind us. So instead, I add the one light, and I take the really crappy lemon light, and I make it into lemonade. It's not great. But what it did do was we start chatting. "Hey, how are you doing? I'm JC." Somebody before, Travis asked, "What's photography to you?" For so many of the people that I know in my life, I met because I have my camera with me. So we start chatting. It turns out she's on America's Next Top Model at the time. Turns out that she lives in New York City. Turns out that she's got some bikinis that she wants to shoot on the beach the next day. Turns out that she got married this year and was like, "Hey, come shoot my wedding." All because I had the flash. If I didn't have the flash, I would not have been able to make a decent picture of her. So carrying your camera and carrying your flash can go a long way towards making great life. That's the point of that story.
I love that story.
It's a great story. It really, I'm going to close this class out with a picture of Zoe jumping because, I can. I want to say thank you again to everybody. Like, really, it was really an honor for Deb to think of me for this because, I definitely don't think of myself. When I look at the other people that are speaking today and even the people that are on the panel that are really talented and heavyweights in this industry, I hope that you guys all got something. I hope there's some questions because that tells me people were listening.
Yeah, I definitely have some stuff here, and I want to thank you so much for being here because I'm a lover of lights and always having some sort of light as well. Because to me, it's just like, why would you carry a bunch of paints and not the paintbrushes? Like I can paint with 100%. These lights everywhere and do amazing things. So we definitely got a couple questions here, and I want to tell people right after this we're actually doing the raffle. So JC, I hope you stick around that because you're one of the raffle prizes is from Westcott, and we got Jennifer coming up right after this at 1:30. So let's jump into a couple of the questions we have. Like, how do you know or change your flash duration?
All right, that's a great question. So flash duration is not something that you generally can change. There are some units that you can these days, but it's mostly related to the power of your flash. And when I say power, I'm saying how much power we have given into it. So if you're shooting manual and you're at 1-to-1 full power, generally your flash duration it's going to depend on the unit. A lot of people don't realize that speed lights are called speed lights not because they're fast to set up or because they're, easy to get out. It's because they have a really fast flash duration that can freeze action. Years and years ago, strobes, there's a reason that some strobes cost more than others when you get into the bigger ones. Usually a faster flash duration is something that is a desirable thing. Now, there are times when it's not, where a slow flash duration, like when we're using rear curtain sync or something, like it can help as a creative tool. But flash duration is not something that I think about, other than the fact that I know that if I turn down the power on my flash, I'm going to get a faster flash duration, which is going to freeze action a little bit better, which sounds like so much of this all sounds counterintuitive if you don't think about it too much. But the flash duration is the amount of time it takes from being totally off to its peak to being totally off again. The less power there is going into your unit, the faster that happens. So if I'm shooting action, I tend to turn down my flash. I skipped the section in order to get the class this short. ISO is one of those things I talk about. Why would I raise ISO? Sometimes I raise ISO so that I can shoot faster, so I can turn down the power on my flash and have it go faster, which gives me a faster flash duration. I hope that takes care of it.
It does, and actually you went into another question. Someone was asking shutter versus ISO because of the ambient light, and the times that you would actually use ISO and pump your ISO, because it looks like you're usually sticking at 100.
Right. So I'm a 64 100 guy.
Is 64 native on your camera, or is that?
I'm now shooting with something where it's not.
Okay.
Many of the high resolution Nikons are 64 is base.
Gotcha. Someone wanted to know about, do you use light meters, or because of these new digital cameras and mirrorless, are you kind of just taking a shot for the ambient and then taking a shot with the fill?
Yes. Yeah, it's been a long time. That's been a question that comes up a lot. Westcott doesn't make one, so I don't feel bad saying that I don't. When I first was starting, I did it like everybody did, but I also couldn't trust the screen on the back of the cameras 10 years ago. Nowadays, and I know it sounds like I'm crazy. I don't even really look at my curves so much, because so many of my pictures are going to go. They're not going to follow a traditional curve.
Yeah,
they're going to be either a lot of shadow or a lot of light because of the way I shoot. So the light meter to me was something that was a great learning tool early on, but it goes with reveling in failure. Making so many mistakes early on and being able to look at a scene and go, well, I'm not beating. If I'm shooting at noon, I know I'm going to be around full power. If I'm shooting at dusk, I know that I'm going to start out at like an 1/8, maybe a 1/16, because I don't have to, overcome so much ambient light.
Right. A question here I'm going to throw to you is, if you could run out of the house and only grab one modifier for your flash, what would it be?
Do I have to carry it, or somebody else gonna?
Well, the follow-up question: what is your favorite modifier?
I've had a long love affair with the Apollos, with the orbs, and that goes. I work at Westcott now. Obviously, I'm biased, but I took the job at Westcott because I had used Westcott stuff for a long time. When they called, I was lucky that I was called and offered the job. Which is nice. That goes back to having a relationship, and I used the gear because for me they were like the best blend of quality versus cost and the ability to carry the stuff around. The Apollos are based on an umbrella, so that was always the thing that was easy to carry around. I showed that slide in there in the middle of the things that I carry that are in my car, and no, I won't tell you guys where I parked the car because they're with me all the time. But I love all of the the rapid box stuff because it folds down small. If I was picking one, it'd be the medium octa probably, because it gives me the most flexibility. I'm going to put a grid on it, because I have a little bit more control. That gives me the ability to make a really soft picture on one person, move it back and have a little bit more directional light. Or if I need to get 2 or 3 people in a shot and light them all nicely and evenly, it's going to be that best compromise between them all.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of the rapid box too. It just works well. It sets up quickly. It folds down nice and quick. It's a great thing. Another question we have here is, I'm not advanced, so I hope this question is not obvious. Here's the problem I'm having. I'm documenting protest. How can I photograph protest march at night so the movement and very little light, because there's movement and very little light? Thanks. This was an excellent presentation.
So that's a great question. And it's one of those situations where, for me, Deb mentioned this earlier, The long version of this has a section about how to get the flash off the shoe. Because to me, if I'm shooting, I shot a little bit of some of the, the protests, but not that much. I'm not in the city anymore. But I'm going to use probably something relatively wide, relatively fast as far as a lens to get the scope of what's going on. And then I'm going to use aperture and the light to show where I want people to look. And moving the flash around in my hand, whether it's off of a shoe cord or I'm using an optical means to set it off or a radio, is going to let me take that flash. And I didn't talk about zooming the flash head because there's just not enough time to do this.
Well, hopefully, if not, we can have you back and kind of devote another section of this
long form.
I would love at some point when things get back to normal, we can actually kind of show up in a place and play with all the Westcott gear.
I would love that.
Yeah.
So whenever you're ready. But to answer that question, TTL becomes your friend. Almost all the cameras today have a really great ability to use auto ISO. Setting the auto ISO and setting TTL together can become a really powerful tool to make some dynamic images when you're in that situation where you're running and you're gunning. But for me, it's still, I do prefer taking my flash off the shoe. But again, like Debbie said, I'm 6'5", 300 pounds. So are
there any precautions you should worry about when you're using TTL and auto ISO? Do you tell it not to go certain places, or how does it affect one another?
I'm going to dial in. I tend to, almost all the cameras allow you to dial in the top ISO that you want to go to. I'm going to put it to something probably a little lower than I would if I was shooting sports, let's say, and I wasn't going to use lights at all. So I might say 800. And, so that if we walk through a pocket of light, it goes down. I don't want it to be at its top. But I do know that my strobe, whether it's a speed light or whatever I'm using, is going to be my main light source in this scene.
Right.
But because of flash duration, which we talked about before, it's going to freeze action. I didn't get it, shooting that is very similar to when I shoot concerts. Anybody who decides to go and look at my JC Photo Media Instagram will see, unfortunately right now I'm not doing a lot of it, but I shoot a lot of punk rock and hardcore and that stuff, but I shoot from the pit, not the photo pit. I shoot where the people are jumping on my head, which is similar to shooting at a protest.
The mosh pit.
I'll shoot a slower shutter speed to allow a sense of motion around them, and the flash duration is going to freeze the actual subject, whether it's the singer or a guitar player or somebody in the middle of that mosh. Wow. So it's a similar kind of thing.
JC, thank you so much. And where can people follow up for and look for your stuff? And if they have further questions that they were too shy to ask, kind of follow up with you.
JC Photo Media on Instagram. I just put it on there. Or jcarey at fjwestcott.com. Those are the two easiest places to hit me up.
Fantastic.
And I will answer all emails and all Instagram messages.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
You guys.
Awesome. Appreciate and we'll be right back with our next guest. Well, I think it's time for our next guest. And who would that be, Deborah?
That would be Jennifer Stoots, and she's here. She's just turning her mic and her video on.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about Jennifer?
Okay, Jennifer is both. She studied both as a painter and as a photographer before she became an art appraiser, and so she comes at this from all this collecting and all this from the position of an artist. So that makes a big difference in the way she talks about art and photography.
So there's a pretty good reason we have here today, correct?
Yes, and
she's sort of a specialist on something, and today is based on what? You know what? Let's go straight to the horse's mouth. Jennifer, hello, and why are you here? And what are you going to talk about?
Yeah. So, yes, I actually was trained as a painter and photographer and managed a photography gallery in Portland, Oregon from 1998 to 2004. And it was in 2002 I got my credentials to start appraising photography, photographic archives, and artwork. So, and I've been in the industry for 26 years. I've been in the fine art photography market for 24, and I've been appraising for 18. So wow. I've been around a while.
So we're asking all our guests today one simple question, and it is on the most personal level to you. What is photography to you?
Photography is stories. It's people, it's politics, it's medicine, it's communication, it is history, and it's the anecdotes. You know, it's that chewy center that I really gravitate to, and that's why I love photography history. And above and beyond that, it walks so many lines. You know, so many images are made for a very specific purpose, but then they come over into the fine art realm or historical realm and are appreciated for their aesthetics as well as their message.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to let you go right into your thing today. And are you sharing a screen with us, or are you just going to?
I am. This is going to be a very
Wonderful.
traditional sort of photography history kind of presentation, especially considering I was only given 15 minutes for this rather big topic.
Well, we have to have you come back another time to do a full.
So you're only covering the, from 1700 up to 1900, right?
Oh gosh, no. So actually longer than that. So first off, my sincere thanks to Deborah for inviting me to present today. And so I will be looking at the inception of photography, and specifically looking at the development of the daguerreotype. So because of the time constraints, I don't always reference the photographer that's on the screen, but everything is clearly labeled. And I'm happy to take questions afterwards, and a bibliography is available for anyone who's...
Fabulous. So if anybody has a question, please throw it in the Q&A, and we'll answer it afterwards.
All right. So
it's all yours.
Thank you so much. By the mid-1820s, Louis-Jacques Mende Daguerre had established himself as one of the premier entertainers of Paris. His interest in new technology as a means to improve business, coupled with his personal network, would serve him well in devising and promoting, quote, one of the most important inventions of the 19th century, end quote. In this exceptionally brief presentation, we will touch on the motivations of invention, the birth of a new industry, and, oops, pardon me, having a little trouble here. Birth of a new industry and current collectibility of what was originally referred to as a mirror with a memory. As with many innovations and developments, the path to fixing an image was a particularly long and circuitous one. We know that the Chinese scholar Mo Qi, who was active around 450 BCE, conducted light experiments using a pinhole. His observations were the foundation for the basic principles of optics and were included in the Mohist canon known as the Mozi or the Mojing. The most significant and influential contribution to the understanding of optics was written by the Persian polymath Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham, known in the medieval Europe as Alhazen. Written over a 10-year period while under house arrest for madness, Alhazen's 11th century tome, known in the West as the Opticae Thesaurus, was based on practical experiments examining the behavior of light and is said to include the first accurate description of the camera obscura. Yet, while major steps had been made in the understanding and defining optics, the chemistry lagged far behind. The darkening effect that sunlight and moonlight had on silver nitrate and silver chloride had been described in earlier periods by Pliny the Elder and Albert Magnus, respectively. It wasn't until the early 18th century that the foundations for the compound's photogenic potential were laid by the German polymath Johann Heinrich Schulze. Needless to say, the marriage of optics and chemistry did not start to take shape until the end of the 18th century, and success wasn't achieved until the early 19th. As is well known, the retired French officer and former government administrator, Joseph Niepce, achieved success by 1827. Although he initially experimented with paper soaked in silver chloride, ultimately registered an image on metal plate coated with bitumen of Judea, an asphalt derivative. It's important to remember that the 19th century was driven by the tenets of post-Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. in that there was a keen interest in shifting from manual to mechanical. Economic growth of the era encouraged experimentation and rewarded innovation. The nascent Royal Academy in London was instrumental in anointing inventions worthy of merit and investment. Confident in his success, Niepce presented his heliograph to a committee at the Royal Academy, but they were unconvinced of its commercial or potential. The inventor left the heliograph with his host as a parting gift and began the journey home. Thanks to an introduction by his Parisian optician Vincent Chevalier, Niepce met with Louis-Jacques Mende Daguerre on his way to London. Having no subsequent success with the Royal Academy, he arranged to meet with Daguerre once more, presumably to discuss at greater length the potential of collaborating on future photogenic experiments. Louis-Jacques Mende Daguerre had, by the mid-1820s, established himself as one of the premier entertainers of Paris. Taking the art of set design and replacing story and actors with dramatic lighting effects, Daguerre and his partner, Charles-Marie Bouton, created a sensation known as the diorama. To keep audiences returning, the large painted scenes needed to be changed regularly, which was a laborious task. Hence, Daguerre's motivated interest in finding a way to easily fix an image projected by the camera obscura. Niepce and Daguerre began a correspondence, and in 1829 formed a partnership with intent to achieve a mutual goal for mutual commercial benefit. Their first joint project resulted in the Daguerreotype, which is a process based on the sensitivity of resins. 4 years into that partnership, Niepce dies, and per the terms of the contract, his son Isidore inherited his father's share. Although efforts were made, Isidore Niepce was not as scientifically minded as his father. As a consequence, Daguerre started flying solo. By 1837, his experiments were bearing fruit, and part of his success was using mercury vapor as a developing agent. As he started to achieve stable results, he convinced Isidore to sign a clause to the original agreement that he, Daguerre, could name himself sole inventor for his independently developed process if successful. When Daguerre stabilized and finalized his daguerreotype process, the politicking began. Support of the Academy of Sciences was crucial, and he engaged the noted physicist and astronomer François Arago as his representative. Arago was also a member of the French legislature. As is well known, Daguerre received a lifetime pension for the invention in exchange for public access to the process. Arago announced the daguerreotype to a joint session of the Académie des Sciences and the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris on January 9, 1839. The news was published in the French press the next day, England the following week, and a Stockholm newspaper reported on, quote, one of the most important inventions of the century, end quote, 3 weeks later on January 28. Although Daguerre was required to reveal, demonstrate, and publish detailed instructions of the daguerreotype process, he retained the copyright of the published manuals and maintained patents on the equipment needed to practice the new technology. On August 19, 1839, Daguerre explained his process step by step to a joint session of the academies. Briefly, the process includes a polished silver plate sensitized using iodine and bromine fumes. After exposure, the plate is developed using mercury vapors fixed with hyposulfate, an added later improvement courtesy of Sir John Herschel, and rinsed with distilled water. Prior to any coloring or casing, a layer of heated gold chloride is poured over the plate to harden the surface and enrich tones. By mid to late September, Daguerre's manual was available in English. By Christmas, it had been translated into Swedish. The manual, in fact, was translated into 8 languages within 18 months of being released, and the French manual sold through 30 editions. In addition, and in partnership with his brother-in-law, Daguerre designed the Giraud Daguerreotype Camera, which was made available in limited quantities. The camera is said to have weighed over 100 pounds and sold at a cost of 600 francs, which in today's dollars would be about $2,360 if calculations are correct. This lithograph by Theodore Morissette playfully illustrates the excitement and frenzy that emerged, illustrating those who wanted to make images and the people who wanted to have their images taken. As with many new technologies, the initial offerings were expensive and imperfect. As mentioned, the Giraud Daguerreotype camera was originally about $2,400 today. A year later, the cost came down to $51 in the US, which is approximately $1,500 today, and the plates were $2 each, which is about $60. In its earliest days, long exposures were necessary, and as a consequence, the daguerreotype was best used for still life arrangements, landscapes, and photographing architecture. Those capable tinkered with the materials and chemistry in an effort to improve its deficiencies and slowness. Per the Met, quote, Choiselat and Rattel, among the earliest practitioners to utilize and improve upon Daguerre's process, first published their methods for enhancing the sensitivity of the daguerreotype plate in 1840 and had achieved exposure times of under 2 seconds by 1843. Unlike Daguerre's long exposure, which failed to record the presence of moving figures, their image, on the right, does include people. Still more striking is the dramatic rendering of the cloud-laden sky, achieved by the innovative technique of masking the upper portion of the plate partway through the exposure, end quote. Recognizing that Francois Arago, who had lobbied on behalf of Daguerre, was an astronomer, it's not surprising that the daguerreotype was used to photograph the skies. That said, initial attempts to photograph the moon resulted in mere blurs or white specks. According to one scholar, Ann Thomas, what James Whipple, photographer, and George Bond, astronomer, figured out was that the daguerreotype chemistry was sensitive to blue light. By making the appropriate adjustment to focus the telescope toward the blue spectrum, they were essentially switching their lens from a visual to a photogenic focus, allowing for a more detailed rendering of the Earth's satellite. The daguerreotype was patented in England, but was otherwise free of restrictions. Per the scholar Naomi Rosenblum, very few women took up photography in its earliest years. One of the few known is the Swiss daguerreotypist Franziska Mühlinger. Even though only one of her daguerreotypes has survived, what we do have is a series of lithographs that was produced using her images as basis. The daguerreotype flourished throughout Europe and the eastern seaboard of the United States. Its uses beyond those borders, however, were generally Westerners who could afford to travel with the photographic equipment and the materials required to prepare and develop plates on the road. In these final few minutes, I've been asked to touch on current collectibility. As with many media, value is dependent on the prominence of the artist or maker, the identification and or status of the sitter, or historical relevance of the subject matter, signature, annotations, and condition, as well as provenance. As an art and photography appraiser, I am often reviewing sales at public auction. As such, and to give you a better sense of the market spectrum, on October 5th, 2017, a selection of daguerreotypes were offered at Sotheby's, New York, items from the esteemed Dr. Stanley Burns collection. Despite provenance, the sale did poorly overall, with only 38% of the items finding buyers. In other words, only 20 out of the 53 lots sold. That said, what did sell was a reflection of what's of interest. I'm based on the West Coast and have been aware for some time that quite a few institutions have been in search of early photographic representations of Chinese immigrants and workers. As such, it was not a surprise to see that this daguerreotype of Chinese gold miners sold for a particularly healthy sum. Again, what is paramount is the who and the what. Among the most precious jewels are the daguerreotypes by Joseph Philibert Giraud de Pranget. Trained as a painter, Giraud de Pranget was an avid student of ancient Near East architecture and embarked on a 3-year tour of Italy, Greece, Egypt, Turkey, Syria, and Palestine. He and his likely entourage carried hundreds of pounds of equipment on their journey and made more than 800 daguerreotypes, including some of the earliest known surviving photographs of the Acropolis. In 1851, Louis-Jacques Mende Daguerre died. His passing coincided with the fade of the daguerreotype's popularity. Just a few years prior, Frederick Scott Archer introduced the wet collodion process, which would gain interest, prove versatile, and remain popular into the 1890s. Coupled with that was Louis Désiré Blancard Evard's albumen print process, which would become equally popular until the end of the 19th century. Although the daguerreotype remained superior in clarity, the less expensive processes, such as the tintype and the amber type, allowed the market to expand, such that the working class could afford to have their photograph taken. Although he was not the first to fix an image, Louis-Jacques Mende Daguerre's business acumen and political savvy secured his name as one of the fathers of photography. Thank you.
Well, I say you packed in a lot in just a short amount of time. That was amazing.
Thank you.
And so perfect for today. Deb, did you have any questions, or did you want to lead into anything?
Well, I just, it used to be, I haven't gone antiquing for a while, but it used to be that you would often see what looked like daguerreotypes at antique flea markets. How do you know, if you see those, that that's what they are? And, how do you know what it's worth to spend for them?
Well, so first off, it's what we refer to as connoisseurship. So the more you look, the more you collect, the more you watch the market, the more you know about what is of interest. And it's also, we're always dealing with people. So as a consequence, things come in and out of vogue. There is a joke by one of my colleagues there in New York: if it's old and or brown, it will most likely have more value in Europe. And with the daguerreotypes, because we don't always know the makers, and it's the same issue with tintypes, that is actually at a disadvantage. So if we know the maker, as I said, if you know the maker, if you know the subject, it's in excellent condition, there is a greater chance that it will have value. That being said, there has been a shift, particularly among institutions, that it really does need to be historically as well as regionally relevant. So, from Washington to California, because there were so many Chinese immigrants in the 19th century who, are responsible for, our railroad system, among others, they are very keen to collect, early images and representations of the Chinese community to better reflect the local history. So, it's a combination of things. But yeah, just because it's old and or brown doesn't necessarily mean it has value.
So if someone was really interested in just buying their first couple, where would they go and look, and what are they looking for?
Well, daguerreotypes are not my area of specialty, but as Deborah mentioned, you can sometimes find them, at flea markets, maybe even estate sales. There are, of course, smaller auction houses, and then, of course, what we looked at was from the bigger auction houses. So Heritage Auctions, for example, which is based in Dallas and really has embraced online auctions, they are also known for Americana and historical ephemera. So they are actually a really good resource and you can sign up as a free member. So what's nice is you can look at the history and you can start to see patterns. So it's like anything else. There are consistencies, but then there's also an ebb and flow because of fad and fashion.
Wow, that's amazing. Did you have something to say, Deb? Or?
No, I just that we have to have Jennifer come back to do a full.
Yeah, I mean, if you could fit that much in 10 or 15 minutes, I would love to see what you can do in an hour.
Oh my goodness, yes. Yes.
Where did the love come from? Where did you where was the first thing you're like, this is it for me. I gotta this is what I want to study. This is what I want to make my career out of. This is where's the first where was the first ember?
Well, actually, so it was, I guess I was about 16. It was around 1987. There was a Time Life special edition of like the best photographs in the world. And I cut out Mary Ellen Mark, Joseph Kudelka, Richard Avedon, what was the other one? And these were pasted to my wall as a teenager.
Wow.
So, and then
See, Deborah was saying she had sports figures, Joe Namath up on the wall. You had Avedon.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, these were mixed with my Duran Duran posters.
Oh, very good.
So there was a balance there. And then I really knew that I was married to it when the Robert Mapplethorpe controversy happened. Actually, my father threatened to cut off my college funding if I bought a Mapplethorpe book.
Wow.
And it was so upsetting to me. And that's when I knew it was a powerful medium that I wanted to protect as well as promote. So I got into, and also in terms of the practice, I was earning awards, for my photographs in high school, but also creating controversy among the parents. And then I get tired in the darkroom, so I don't have the technical savvy that people do, and I gravitated to the stories.
How do you think the industry has changed, and what patterns are you seeing, going from the classic stuff to sort of this new digital age?
Well, it really, so interestingly enough, and you're talking about digitally produced prints?
Yeah.
Okay. So, interestingly enough, your carbon pigment prints are about as stable as anything we've ever had, especially in terms of color. Color has historically been ink-based, it's fugitive. The most stable is the Carbro. And so when it comes to digital, it's still, it is still a very delicate. There are some people who feel like, well, gelatin silver, it's older, it's more valuable, or platinum. I put so much time into crafting a platinum print. And yet when it comes to digital, it really depends on whose name's on it.
Yeah. Do you have a love for one more than another? Like, it's like, oh, my heart is here. It's like, do you have a...
Well, for many, many years, Andre Cortege, was a god among men, and he said, a great photographer should be defined by 100 great images. And once you set that as your parameter, the pool really sort of gets very, very small. But there, I love Abelardo Morel in terms of contemporary. So I'm kind of across the board. And the more I learn about 19th century, the more I'm in love with it. You look at a Carlton Watkins and it's just absolutely phenomenal, what this man went through to capture these images, especially when you know that it's a contact print. If it's a 16 by 20 inch print, it was a 16 by 20 inch plate, and this is the 19th century. They're literally schlepping this stuff around.
Are you collecting yourself?
Modestly as I can. I work in the arts. I'm very, very fortunate. I collected more when I worked for the gallery because it was, like an ice cream shop.
What was the first one that you remember, like, oh, I can't believe I'm spending this much money on this, but I have to have it?
It was actually, I would have to say, a Willem Kritz, Kriz. He was a Czech photographer who, he was in Paris when World War II started, and then he couldn't go back home. So he emigrated to the United States and worked very briefly for Dorothea Lange and ended
Oh,
up
wow.
teaching in either Berkeley or Oakland. But he's a Czech surrealist, and the image I have is actually of the Paris Metro. It's a wonderfully sort of geometric, modernist piece. But yeah, I took almost a year to pay that off.
Well, I want to ask you about collectors and benefactors, because you mentioned Mapplethorpe, and I'm thinking of his big benefactor, Sam Wagstaff, and who amassed this huge collection. And then when someone becomes a collector like that, does that sort of magnify all the work in the collection? I know just to buy even the catalog from the big sale of his collection is a collectible.
Well, so I'm totally in love with Sam Wagstaff. And I could write an entire lecture on Sam Wagstaff. So what's great about Sam is that, first off, his parents were collectors. And then after he was in the armed services, he went into advertising, which he said was, about the most disgusting industry he'd ever been exposed to. And he went back for his art history degree and became a curator. And then, of course, subsequently, he connected with Mapplethorpe, and, the needle went in. And because he was from such an affluent background and had a reputation in the art world as a curator, when he started collecting photography, I mean, he brought a cachet to it, and the needle went in. He was just avid about it. So when you look at his collection and the core of his collection, really, it literally established the Getty's foundation for their photography department. I mean, and it goes from the 19th century, up almost through the 20th. So, he was instrumental in improving the market. He was instrumental, again, in founding, a major collection at a major institution, influential. I mean, and then, of course, Mapplethorpe even admitted, if he hadn't found Sam, he would have found another, sugar daddy. So.
Wow. We could obviously spend all day with you. Your wealth of information is incredible, and your passion for it. I want to thank you so much. Where can people, if they want to follow up or find out some more information, contact you or look up?
My website is stootsllc.com. My last name is a palindrome, so it's STOOTSLLC.com. And you're welcome to email me at any time. Again, I'm happy to provide a list of the photographers I used, as well as a bibliography if anyone's interested.
Oh, thank you so much for taking your time out today and celebrating the day with us.
Congratulations on this wonderful program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.